talked about a little bit would be ketone monitoring. If you are really serious about low carb and you want to transition from a low carb diet, which is not always ketogenic, but once you titrate the glucose and your carbohydrate levels down, you enter a state of ketosis. And this state of ketosis has been linked to many of the metabolic health benefits that I'll be talking about. And the elevation of ketones is really directly proportional to the lowering of insulin. So you can't make ketones unless you suppress insulin down to a certain level. So as Ben Bickman has talked about insulin in a very elegant way, so insulin management is really the key, and ketosis is kind of the fastest way to get there. But you can measure urine ketones. I'm not, some people say that this is not ideal way to measure ketones, but I think it is a good entry level. It tells you semi-quantitatively if you're in ketosis or not. It's very cheap. There's breath ketone monitors. And then there's Keto Mojo, and Abbott makes the Precision Extra. We've used that. We've used these things in all our studies, and they work great, and they're very important tools for behavioral modification, because they could help you titrate your diet and understand your metabolism as you use these things more and more. And as we evolve, I think continuous ketone monitoring will be a thing, and I don't know if it'll catch on to general population, but I think a continuous glucose monitor can be very, very useful for people. For example, this is, if you can see on the, if I can get the laser pointer, this is an example of someone on a low carb diet on the bottom and a high carb diet before they transitioned into a low carb diet. So this is 1 week of continuous ketone measurements. The top would be the standard American diet, or the diet recommended by the American Diabetes Association, if you can believe that, right? And underneath of that is 1 week of continuous ketone or glucose measurements with a carbohydrate restricted diet. I think this was 25 grams or below. So it's between night and day. And as you can see, like, keeping your glucose under that tight level, that's not feasible for everybody, but that's going to pay huge dividends, for example, with the person that has type 1 diabetes and for type 2 diabetes, because we know glucose excursions are linked. Someone who has type 1 diabetes is more likely to die of the top 10 things that will kill you, like everything from heart disease, cancer, to even getting into an accident. So someone who has better glycemic control, who's type 1 diabetes, will be adding 10 years to their life easily. And I will extend that. We don't have the data yet, but I would extend that to the general population too, especially if you're trending to be more like pre-diabetic. So, biomarker monitoring, and I'm kind of kicking off with ketones because that's a big thrust of what we do, and the ketone biomarker is a super important biomarker if you're going into low carb and you want to, maybe if you don't have the ability to measure insulin. Some doctors won't write a script for that. There's insulin kits that I have at home, but I'm here to tell you that your ketone levels, if you maintain between 1 to 2, your insulin level is going to drop through the floor and be at a level that's incredibly helpful for metabolic health. Blood pressure too. We don't talk about it that often, but blood pressure is probably one of the most important cardiometabolic biomarkers. Ketogenic diets and low carb diets, a lot of doctors don't talk about this, but these diets reduce blood pressure more compared to other weight loss diets that just focus on calorie restriction. And that's probably due in part to the lowering of insulin. And when we reduce insulin, we tend to, it reduces sodium. It's called a natriuretic effect and also a mild diuretic effect. So there's a contraction of the plasma volume that lowers your blood pressure. So that, people take like things like hydrochlorothiazide, their water pill. My mom takes her water pill every day when they go out to eat and they have pizza and things like that. Because the ketogenic diet, or it doesn't even have to be ketogenic, a low carb diet will do that naturally. If I was to measure my blood pressure right now, it would probably be trending high. I grabbed an image off Amazon of 134/84, and that's what it was actually when I was taking pictures of the first time I measure my blood. If I'm standing up, if I sit down, it's always trending high. So what you really need to do is measure your blood pressure at different times and do it 3 times. The first time, rest a little bit, breathe, and do another. If you're like me, especially if I go into the doctor, I have white coat hypertension, and I'm always high. So it actually went into my medical records. I went in and I ran from my car, drinking my coffee on the way to the doctors, and they write down 140 over, like, 85, and hypertension, and it goes into my records. And I was like, no, can you do it again? So I rested again, and it was like 120 over 15. So, but if I'm really rested, and I do 3 or 4 measurements, I can bring it down a systolic of 100, and so that's important to, especially if you're at risk for cardiovascular disease. It's really important to effectively monitor. And these are the general. I've worked with a team of about a dozen different doctors on the optimal levels. So that's the levels that I'm putting here. I've worked on various documents for optimizing metabolic biomarkers. I consult for Levels Health, and we have a team of doctors, many of them that many of them are influencer doctors. So those recommendations are put into my slide here. So fasting glucose, and also your postprandial glucose. So I'm just coming out of lunch. It was an amazing lunch. I was eating low carb. The kid next to me was eating a mound of mashed potatoes, and he had pasta, and then he had bread on top of that. And I was thinking, wow, what's that kid? I mean, he was a skinny little kid. He needed the energy probably, but I was just thinking what his, my mind always goes in that direction. What's his postprandial glucose? So your fasting glucose is super important, but your glycemic response to a meal is probably more important, because it may not be capturing the postprandial glycemic excursions, we call it in academia. And so these spikes in glucose over time can accumulate, and it may show up on your hemoglobin A1C, right? And your insulin levels too will be elevated. But it's important to know your fasting glucose, and even if you could do a continuous glucose monitor once or twice a year for 2 weeks, that's really all you need. You don't need to wear these devices all the time. It can be helpful, especially if you're testing different things and different diets or drugs or supplements to optimize, if you will. But these are the levels of, your continuous. If you're looking to get your average glucose, you want your optimal level to be under 120. So that's including all the spikes and everything too. And mine tends to trend higher in the morning and then goes lower throughout the course of the day, even if I start eating more food. But I want to bring to your attention that there's a lot of keto food products out there. One was, I think, Catalina Crunch here, where I have keto cereal. So there are various keto products that I test, and this keto cereal was not keto. So I was wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and you could see my postprandial, and I didn't even put milk on it. So I just weighed out a serving, and I ate it dry out of a bowl, and it had like it was just like eating Cheerios or eating Fruit Loops or something like that. So it's important to know that if you're not monitoring, that you don't know the effect that these foods have. I'm also a big proponent of, single ingredient whole food meals, so it's important that you don't really know what's in your food when you're buying these cereals and other keto related products. So one exception to that is the keto brick. The keto brick is absolutely, that's a very limited amount of ketogenic nutrients, but I have a flat line if I eat an entire keto brick. So there are legitimate, only maybe like 5% of the products out there are legitimately keto, but it's important to acknowledge that most ketone food products are not. Insulin is also probably the most important. I think any endocrinologist or metabolic physiologist or even well-educated clinician will tell you that insulin is the most important metabolic biomarker, but curiously, it's not on a comprehensive metabolic panel. So why is that? There's different reasons for that. In regards to various testing methods and standardization of what insulin levels should be. But there are home kits that can measure your insulin, and you can send the kits in, and they are pretty accurate, because I've done these kits, and there's a number of kits out there that you could search. We use ZRT Labs. Cyfox is another one that's great, and I've done the measurements just before going into a Quest Diagnostics lab, and they are very accurate. So this particular insulin measurement, this cardiometabolic kit that I do also measures high-sensitivity C-reactive protein and hemoglobin A1C. And at this particular time, My insulin was 4.8, which is in the healthy range. You want to keep it between 2 to 6 is optimal, and I would say try to keep it under 10. But I was eating, in this particular case, a higher protein, a much higher, about 2 to 3 times higher than a clinical ketogenic diet protein. I was following more of a keto carnivore approach. So just to show you, and prior to that, with a strict ketogenic diet, my insulin is maybe about 3. So it's a little bit higher if I really bump up my protein or double it, but it's still in a very healthy range. And some people are a little bit concerned about their glycemia. As you can see, my hemoglobin A1C was 3.9. So that's super low. And my HSCRP also maintained 0.1, sometimes non-detectable on this diet. So hemoglobin A1C is also really important to measure. It'll capture the aggregate of your blood glucose over a 3-month period. So it's important to get this on a yearly cardiometabolic exam. Hemoglobin A1C is glycated hemoglobin over 3 months. And there's a lot of data on hemoglobin A1C as a biomarker in regards to cardiovascular disease, nephropathy, your eye health. So this is a biomarker that has a long track record of literature behind it. So your optimal level should be under 5.2. That's pretty low. There was, a couple times I was above that when I was starting keto, but it dropped down over time. You really just want to make sure that it's below 6.4. Uric acid is another one. There's commercially available meter. Dr. David Perlmutter actually sent me a meter with his book to measure. So I did some uric acid sort of experiments looking at different foods that could impact that. Diets that are high in sugar, especially high in fructose, can increase uric acid. I found that alcohol can increase it, even 1 glass of wine, but mildly, but typically post-alcohol. So it bumps up and then comes back down pretty quickly. But hyperuricemia is linked to, high purine foods, right? So foods that are high, like organ meats, for example. These are all the foods that I eat. I mean, I sat down and ate a meal of liver with red wine, and I had fruit after it. So I'm getting like the trifecta of things that should increase uric acid, and it bumped up a little bit, but it came back down. The important message here is that if your metabolic health is good, you don't have to eliminate or even restrict high purine foods. You can have alcohol in moderation and have fruit and be totally fine if your metabolic health is good. So you can get away with a lot. So that also includes something I'm going to talk about, your LDL. So there's so much wind about LDL. I try to pull it out of my talk, but I'm going to talk about it a little bit. But if your metabolic health is good, it's far, far less important to track that biomarker. High sensitivity C-reactive protein. The HSCRP just gives you a better resolution within a lower range in the 0.1 to 1 or 10 milligrams per liter range. And it's really, I found that a lot of people, dozens if not hundreds of people send me their blood work, and gut health is tightly linked to HSCRP. It's also sort of bidirectionally influenced by your psychological state. So intense stress can actually impact gut permeability, and that could disrupt inflammation in the body, increase inflammation. So we know missing a night of sleep can increase your HSCRP, probably by impacting your gut health. Heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, leaky gut. If you have an infection, this is going to increase your HSCRP. So if you see it bump up, I say don't panic, especially maybe if you're just getting over something, but it is an important biomarker to track, and it should be included. And it's typically not included in a typical blood work, but adding it on, most doctors will do it. If you could come up with an excuse and say you have autoimmune diseases in your family or something like that, they can add it. I've gotten it added. So vitamin B12 is also something that's typically not included, but really should be included, because almost everybody's blood work that I see that's not eating a lot of meat or liver, or especially if they're trending towards more plant-based, they have pathologically low vitamin B12. So, and if you want to supplement it, I recommend methylcobalamin over the cyanocobalamin. Low B12 can result in symptoms of Alzheimer's disease. I've talked to our Alzheimer's clinic. When people come in, they now test for that. Low levels of vitamin B12 are associated with brain atrophy and hippocampal atrophy. So this is not good, right? So it can actually mimic Alzheimer's disease if you're deficient in vitamin B12. So it's pretty easy to bring back up with supplementation. I teach the GI section. Also, there's something called pernicious anemia. So vitamin B12 plays a really big role in your red blood cells, and it plays a huge role in many different metabolic enzymes in your metabolism in general. So as we age, we get decreased levels of something called intrinsic factor. Intrinsic factor allows vitamin B12 to be absorbed and utilized. So as we age and we approach 50 or above, probably more and more important to track it, but also to supplement. So at the end of the list, or towards the end of the list, is triglycerides. It should probably be right in the front, but triglycerides, HDL, and ApoB too. So ApoB is important, especially if your biomarkers are suboptimal. It becomes even more important. And ApoB, I would lump that in with LDL cholesterol too. So triglycerides are by far more important. Optimal ranges under 60. HDL, extremely important. More of kind of a biomarker of your general health and lifestyle. Males tend to trend a lot lower on HDL. So you really want to get that above 50 and ideally above 60, your HDL. So make sure this is on your cardiometabolic panel. And ApoB is something that your doctor may not be aware of, but it's a better biomarker than LDL. There's more research behind it as being causative, and it's a more accurate indication of your dyslipidemia. So ApoB is not, my ApoB was quite high, and I was able to lower it with a few different interventions. If you're in good cardiovascular health, I think you're probably fine with an ApoB of 130, maybe even 140 to 150. But if you have a history of cardiovascular disease and it's in your family and your other biomarkers are not optimal, you definitely want to bring it down under, say, like 110. Many doctors will say to bring that down to 50 or lower, but I do not believe that that's the case. Dave Feldman is doing a lot of work with lean mass hyperresponders. Obviously, they have higher ApoB as with LDL, and this is sort of a much different scenario that's under investigation now. So if you are trending to be more of a lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, ApoB is probably less important, but the jury is kind of still out, and I'm not going to take a hard position until we get more data on that. But I do have a little bit of data to share with you on LDL and ApoB because I did a self-experiment with a drug called Zetia. The generic name is ezetimibe, and I took a half dose for 6 weeks, and it cut my LDL and ApoB in half. And this was very curious to me because that is not a typical response to, ezetimibe is much, much safer than something like a statin. So it specifically blocks the Niemann-Pick C1-like 1 receptor for cholesterol absorption. So it indicated that I was a super hypercholesterol absorber. So a doctor recommended that I do a test, and I do have a very rare mutation for the Niemann-Pick C1-like 1 receptor. It's apparently a gain-of-function mutation that allows me to just absorb a lot of cholesterol from when I'm eating. So I took a very small dose and then knocked the dose down to a half dose just twice a week. And these numbers were maintained. So my LDL went from 207 to 104, and my ApoB, my triglycerides went down too. So that it went from 60 to 48, and my ApoB level, my ApoB went from 165 to 85 off essentially microdosing something like ezetimibe. And that's probably because I have this rare mutation that I hyperabsorb cholesterol. And I've talked to a lot of lean mass hyperresponders, and only maybe about a dozen that I talked to, 2 or 3 had this, but they didn't get genetically tested yet. So just something to consider. It also significantly raised my ApoA1 from, I forget what the starting point, but it's now like 176, and this dropping, essentially microdosing it. So I'm off ezetimibe now. I don't want to take any drugs. So that's like the part of nutritional approaches for metabolic optimization, is that I want to take the least amount of drugs possible. So instead of, and I calculated my dietary cholesterol to be between 3,000 milligrams to 5,000 milligrams a day. Our early ancestors probably only got about 500 milligrams per day. So because I'm eating like a dozen eggs and like 2 pounds of steak and everything, my cholesterol consumption is quite high. So I'm trying to bring that down to normal. And I got off of ezetimibe and I added psyllium husk fiber in the evening. And I'm doing an experiment now, and I'm going to do blood work probably in another month to see where I'm at. So I've been off ezetimibe for about 2 or 3 weeks. And I feel fine, and when I dropped my ApoB and LDL to much lower levels, I didn't have any negative consequences to that. So again, I would not consider a statin, so I thought the ezetimibe was sort of a safer option to test for people that may be concerned with elevated ApoB or LDL. Not that you're gonna respond like I did because I'm a hyper absorber, but I'm just sharing this data with you, and it's an experiment and process right now. Some other advanced testing that I do is, there's different companies out there. Genova Diagnostics is one, and they have the Metabolomics Plus, which looks at many different biomarkers, including the omega-3 fatty acids, so similar to an omega quant test. Really important to understand your omega-3 to omega-6 ratio. Included in this test is also a very comprehensive measurement of heavy metals. And I tend to eat a lot of fish, sometimes several pounds of fish per day. So I was curious about that. So I was happy to see that my lead and my mercury levels were really low. When I did this particular test, we had just gotten back from the Dominican Republic, I think, when I did this test, and I picked up some kind of little bug there, and I took Pepto-Bismol, which is bismuth. So the only heavy metal that kind of shot off the roof was bismuth. And if you look at you can see it's super hot on the panel here. So that was a mystery to me till I realized that Pepto-Bismol has bismuth in it. So, but it's just an indication that these tests are super sensitive. And I also did a hair test to look at some of the other ones too. And they were super low. So maybe I'm a good detoxifier, or maybe I'm just choosing fish too. I tend to eat pounds of sardines, pounds of mackerel, and then salmon and other fish. So one looking at my diet would think that my heavy metals should be off the charts, but they're not. Not that everybody eating this kind of diet would not be. But I think it's really important to choose certain types of fish that are lower in heavy metals. So the takeaways that I have, and with just a few minutes remaining, is that there are many expanding applications of ketone metabolic therapy. So epilepsy, we all agree, clinically agree, that that's actually the standard of care for drug-resistant epilepsy. And in the last 10 years, the number of applications has skyrocketed. Weight loss and type 2 diabetes is kind of like the low-hanging fruit, but I also think that there's an emerging field of metabolic psychiatry, and I think that this could be the future, because we do have a mental health crisis, and I think improving our metabolic health will change our metabolism, obviously, but also fundamentally changes the neuropharmacology of our brains. So as a brain scientist, we know that GABA levels change, serotonin, dopamine levels change, the reward pathways change in ways that could drastically improve our health and our energy levels, which will help us follow lifestyle interventions that can also then go on to improve our metabolic health. So self-monitoring, I really do think is important. I'm not very prescriptive about it, but I do think that it can become a really important behavioral tool. When you see your blood glucose going down, for example, with a CGM, when you see your ketones going up, that's giving you a good reward and helping you to follow, the intervention that's changing that biomarker. So I'm an experiment in progress with the ezetimibe. So if someone's considering statins and they don't know about ezetimibe, I would, and they, it might be good to do a genetic test if you have astronomically high LDL or ApoB. I'm also of the opinion that if your other metabolic biomarkers are in good health, that this is less of an important biomarker to be worried about. But I guess the question is, if everything else is optimal and you have an astronomically high ApoB or LDL, are you in better condition if you bring that down into a healthier range? So we do not know the answer to that question, but I would say low LDL is bad. Low LDL is associated with, I see a lot of blood work and lower LDL. People with cancer, for example, have lower LDL, and it tends to just all-cause mortality. A number of things, a number of reviews have been written about all-cause mortality and LDL levels, and they do not support that. Low is good. They do not support that super high is also good, but a good healthy range could be 200. And I would probably say if you guys are low carb, there's many people here that have an LDL right around 200. And your doctor is quick, as my doctor was, to bring a prescription. And when she saw mine at 275, she was telling me to, you know, make arrangements for my funeral. Like she was saying, when I see these numbers, it's not good. But she's like, I've never seen anyone with like triglycerides of 39 either, or an HDL of 67 or 70. So she had never seen anyone like me, but in our community, we see this quite frequently. So we need to put it into context. And tracking vitamin D, magnesium, body, I even get to talk about it, but body composition, strength, and sleep are super important. And Brian covered sleep, and I slept, I don't know how you guys slept last night, but on the ship, I just slept like a baby. I probably had the best sleep ever, and maybe because of the low stress and the great food or whatever, but these are other things that I think should be tracked. So, and there's a wide variety of devices out there, like the Oura Ring. I wear a Fitbit, and there's different things. And a DEXA scan. So I would actually recommend people do an in-body, like an in-body 570 or something, to get a general body composition. But the DEXA scan will also give, especially for women, your bone mineral density. So just do a yearly DEXA, and it'll tell you if your resistance training and your nutrition is actually optimizing your lean body mass and your bone mass. Super important as we age, just to do it once a year. And these are some of the current research projects that we have going on. I mentor PhD students, and we have a number of different clinical trials too. And really just like to thank all our labs, especially my wife, who's been in the trenches doing a lot of work, you know, in the lab, but also writing papers. And you'll hear her talk tomorrow on ketone supplementations, the neuroprotective effects of this. We live on a farm, and we don't have kids, but we have 8 cows, 4 sheep, and 2 dogs, so that's our family. And yeah, I want to thank you for being here, for investing in your health to be part of this community, and you guys inspire me all, and thank you for listening.